Hello, this is Nigel here with additional content from Jonah chapter 4. This will be the last in these series of videos, and this follows up the talk I did on Winchester Vineyard Online last Sunday on Jonah chapter 4. So this video won't make much sense unless you've watched the previous talk. But like the others of these additional videos, this is just a chance to dig in a little bit deeper into some of the Bible text and some of the things that are going on that we didn't get time to look at in the main talk on Sunday. Most of it comes from the Bible Project, from a class at the Bible Project, which is run by a guy called Tim Mackey. In fact, I've discovered that the Jonah class, which has been up there for about a year, was a beta for their classroom series and isn't there anymore, so you aren't able to do this course, but they do have some other courses which are fantastic and I highly recommend, and I'll tell you about them at the end. Anyway, this is just a reminder about the overview. This is the Bible Project's overview of Jonah. We've worked all the way through the story. By way of just saying, I think this is a really helpful reminder. Along the top it talks about how Jonah is unique among the prophets, or this book is unique among the prophets, because this isn't the words of a prophet, this is a story about a prophet. There's a little bit alluded to Jonah's other appearance in the Old Testament, which we have looked at before. And then if you look right at the far end, to the far right, it's interesting. This is just their take on this book. This book is trying to mess with you, and it's asking, are you okay with God loving your enemies? And aren't you glad that God loves his enemies? That's kind of, I suppose, the message of the book encapsulated, and then we've got the 4 chapters. And so we've made it to chapter 4 by now. The people of Nineveh have, Jonah has preached to them, they have repented, and God has relented and not destroyed them. In fact, Nineveh has been transformed, and all of chapter 4, which is Jonah's second prayer, is all about how Jonah responds to that. And just a quick reminder, I've said this in the last couple of things, this is a quote from Tim Mackey: in the book of Jonah, everything is upside down and everybody does the opposite of their stereotypes, including the pagans and including Jonah. And it seems like the only person who's true to form is God. And so there are 3 key sections in chapter 4, and we looked at this in the other talk. The structure of the first part, which is Jonah's anger, and I just pointed out how parts of this passage allude to the story of Cain in Genesis 4, and then to the story of Israel, and then to God talking to Moses in Exodus 34. And I just wanted to unpick that a little bit. Again, most of these are from Tim Mackey from the Bible Project. Here is just a bit of more of a breakdown of where the story of Jonah in Jonah chapter 4 links up with the story of Cain in Genesis chapter 4, and it talks very specifically about heat anger. God in chapter 1 was evil to Jonah, a great evil, and there was heat anger on him. That's the description of Jonah in verse 1, and then in verse 4 God says, is it doing good that there's heat anger on you? And if you look over to the other side, there's a very similar use of these phrases. So Yahweh regarded Abel and his offering, but Cain and his offering, and he did not regard, and there was heat anger. It's the same phrase. It's translated just as angry in our translations. And again, God questions Cain, why is there heat anger on you? Isn't it the case that if you do good there is exaltation? So there's something about doing good as well. So you've got these same phrases. I can't pronounce the Hebrew because I'm not that clever, but same phrases cropping up each time. And Tim Mackey makes the point that in Genesis 4, Cain is angered by God's choice to show favour to Abel instead of himself, which leads to anger and murder and a further exile east of Eden, my bad. In Jonah's case, he too is angry by God's mercy on Nineveh, which leads to anger and a desire for his own death, because the death of his enemies is now impossible, and an exile further east. We'll come to that exile bit a little bit later. Here's where the next bit, where Jonah's words really sort of sync up with the Exodus generation of Israel when they are moaning to Moses. This is after escaping from Egypt. They are in the wilderness and they come up against the sea. And so again, what you've got is real parallels between Exodus 14:12 there, where the Israelites say, is this not the word which we spoke to you in Egypt? And Jonah echoes this, saying, was this not my word while I was still on my own land? Is this not the word? Again, there's that, the Israelites say, leave us alone. Let us serve the Egyptians. And again, Jonah was doing that. I initially fled to Tarshish. I don't want to be part of this. And then here's the real key echo phrase. The Israelites say, it is good for us to serve Egypt rather than we die in the wilderness. And essentially, Jonah's saying something very similar. Yahweh, take my life from me, for good is my death more than my life. And the result of both of these, in the one hand, Moses said to the people, don't fear, stand by and see the salvation of Yahweh, which he will accomplish for you today. For Egypt, which you see today, you will not see ever again. And if you remember, what happened is that God opened up the sea, the Israelites crossed, the sea closed back again, and Pharaoh and his army were killed. On the other side, again echoing the results of Jonah's story here, that Jonah went outside the city, sat east of the city, made himself a shelter, and sat under its shade until he could see. Again, there's that see what might happen in the city. And just Tim Mackey's observations on this, that Israel has escaped into the wilderness and see the armies of Pharaoh drawing near. They accuse Moses of leading them out to the desert to die, and absurdly wish for their death in the wilderness. And Moses assures them, despite their whining, God will save them and overcome their enemies as they go through the waters of the sea. Compare and contrast with Jonah, who was saved through the waters of the sea and has just left the city of Nineveh, and also absurdly wishes for his death. In contrast to Exodus 14, Yahweh is changing and saving his enemies instead of destroying them. So here, God is not destroying Israel's enemies, God is saving them. We'll come to something about that a little bit later. And then the third part, that centerpiece, if you remember this bit here, the centerpiece in blue, these sort of really well-known words about God is gracious and merciful and slow to anger. And here's, in the middle, here's where it happens in Jonah, Jonah 4:2. Again, it's echoed in Exodus 34. You can see that there for yourself. And it's also echoed in the book of Joel, chapter 2. For he's gracious and compassionate, long of anger, and great of covenant love. Isn't that beautiful? And each time that happens, you read about Yahweh relenting concerning his evil. So again, the comment at the bottom here, in Exodus, Israel was spared from divine judgment because of Moses' intercession. We've covered this part of that story already. God's forgiveness of Israel and his renewal of the covenant is summarised in this dense list of God's attributes. They are precisely the character traits of God displayed in the story of the golden calf. He's compassionate, he's gracious, he's slow to anger, he's great in covenant love and great in faithfulness. And they are paradigmic for the following history of Israel. In other words, they become the story of Israel. There's this, the whole story of the whole of Israel is that God is compassionate and gracious. And, he had plenty of opportunities to be angry and to give up on them, and never did. Not for a long time. Notice how both Jonah and Joel have merged from the list of Exodus 34 with a narrative statement about Yahweh relenting concerning God's evil. We've talked about this already. God's relenting is precisely... So in Jonah and Joel's case, God relents. In Moses' case, in Exodus, God relents because Moses interceded. In Jonah 4, the prophet ironically criticises God for the very attributes that have sustained his existence in the family of Israel. So, in other words, these beautiful traits of God, his compassion and his grace and the fact that he's slow to anger and great in covenant love, when Jonah says them, he's kind of saying them ironically. Because if you remember, the story is, I ran away because I knew that you were like this, and I knew that you were basically going to forgive these people. And Jonah is cross about that, whereas Moses celebrates that in Exodus 34. Also ironic here, so Jonah is angered that God would show the same mercy to his enemies. And also ironic is that the Ninevites repented as Israel did in Golden Calf, but this time without any intercessor. Because Jonah has been an anti-Moses. In a sense, Jonah's been the opposite of Moses. He's said these things in a different way. Hope this all makes sense. Hope you're finding some interest in this. Here's a great quote from a guy called Philip Carey, who's a commentator on this, and I think this is really helpful. We must be clear where Jonah gets it wrong. It's not as if we should never desire justice. It is good news when an oppressor is toppled, or the terrorist is caught, or the torturer is brought to justice. The Lord does indeed take vengeance on his enemies, as Nahum says of Nineveh. But he is the enemy of all who destroy his world. For he is the enemy of all who destroy his world. But the great danger is that instead of simply rejoicing at the vindication of the oppressed, we self-righteously identify ourselves as the oppressed, and we take pity on ourselves and not on others. Oh, it's us. We've had such a bad time because God is looking after our enemies. So in our imaginations, the Lord becomes a weapon in our campaign to destroy our enemies, an instrument of our own revenge, rather than the righteous judge of all the earth. I think that's really interesting in these times. I think we've seen some of that in some of what's been going on over in the States in the last few months. But that's, not the only place. We see this around the place, and it's just something we need to be careful of. People who use God's vengeance as a weapon in their campaign to destroy their enemies. Okay, the biblical theme of God's repentance concerning evil means that the God of Israel is more inclined to save his enemies than destroy them. This has particular consequences for God's covenant people. It creates a two-sidedness to their calling. They're called to be a vehicle of God's blessing to all the nations, as in Genesis 12, we talked about that before, so that their enemies are not necessarily God's enemies. The repentance of God is not about God changing his mind, but is the fulfillment of his intention to save the wicked, which brings about a new and surprising relation between him and his enemies. Surprising to us, that is, but not to him. I think that's a really interesting thing to ponder on from Philip Carey there. Let's move on to the next section, and this is the section with the two shelters, where Jonah builds himself, first of all, a shelter. And I talked about the festival of Sukkah, or the Feast of Tabernacles. We'll come to that in a second. And then on the other hand, God provides a plant to show that he can also be the provider of the things that Jonah needs. And it's a sort of gift of Eden. There's plenty we could say on this. I'm not going to say very much, but here's just a little bit. Oh, before we get to that, we've already looked at these parallels between Jonah and Cain, but there's another one at the bottom there in verse 5. It says, Jonah went out from the city, and he sat from the east of the city and made for himself a sukkah, a shelter, and he sat under it. The point being that Jonah made himself the shelter, right? And there are just, again, still parallels with the Cain story, where it says Cain went out from before the face of Yahweh and sat in the land of Nod, to the east of Eden. So they've both gone east. And in Cain's case, he built a city and called the name of the city according to his son Enoch. Jonah, it says John there, but Jonah being likened to Cain, who rejected Yahweh's offer of forgiveness and protection and journeyed east of Eden and built his own protection in the form of a city. So in other words, what we've got going on here is, in both cases, we've got people walking out from Yahweh's presence and comfort and going east and looking after themselves. That's what Cain did, and building for themselves the things that they need, and that's what Jonah did. Except that, as we know, God eventually took that away to show Jonah a different kind of message. Just here's some stuff about Sukkah. There's loads on this, and we're not going into it. But the Feast of Sukkah, it's all about God's provision and the blessings of Eden. Okay, the blessings of Eden obviously go right back to Genesis, but they kind of, again, echo right through the Old Testament. And so there's just some passages here. I'm not going into all of them, but in Leviticus 23, we can see that Feast of Sukkah, from the 15th to the 21st of the 7th month, the Israelites were to celebrate an extended 7-day Sabbath. This ritual practice is about self-imposed symbolic exile from their homes to dwell in a sukkah. So they do it themselves. They exile themselves from their home to dwell in a tent. Okay, and the description is just packed with Eden imagery, and it symbolises how God provided Israel with bits of Eden during their sojourn in the desert. You can read some of those texts for yourself. One other point here, halfway down in Deuteronomy 16, the Feast of Sukkot was a time for extreme hospitality to outsiders. And this explains why in Zechariah 14, The ingathering of the nations to worship Yahweh in the New Jerusalem takes place during the Feast of Sukkah. So in other words, and again you can read the text yourself if you want to pause this and just read them, but this is all about gathering nations, letting the immigrant and the orphan. So it's even more ironic that in this place of Sukkah, or sort of self-imposed, like I'm doing this myself, is what Jonah's saying. I can provide for myself, because he's not interested in the immigrant and the orphan and the widows and the strangers and the enemies. And in fact, if you look right down to this Deuteronomy passage, 7 days you shall celebrate the feast of the Lord your God, blah, 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 that you will be altogether joyful. And I made this point the other day. Sukkah is the most joyful festival in all of Israel. And it's at this point that we read about Jonah's joy, but he's not joyful because God has provided for him. He's joyful because he's built himself a tent. No, I take that back. Let's just start that bit again. Let's just look a little bit into the Feast of Sukkah. There's loads we could read about here, and I won't go into all these texts. You can pause the video and read them for yourself if you want to. But just the point here is that in Leviticus 23, we read about this feast and how from the 15th to 21st, the 7th month, Israelites were to celebrate an extended Sabbath. It's a week-long Sabbath. It's a ritual practice, and it's all about self-imposed symbolic exile from their homes to dwell in a sukkah or a tent. So in other words, God is saying, I want you to not live in your house. I want you to build a shelter out from your house and live in that, and remember for a week about how I, God, looked after you with the blessings of Eden, the things that you needed, okay, while you were in the desert. And it's kind of, so it's remembering God's provision and God's blessing. And you can read some of the descriptions there in Leviticus and how they actually link up with Genesis, which is what this whole festival is all about. If you look halfway down, Deuteronomy 16, this feast was a time for extreme hospitality for outsiders to Israel, which explains why in Zechariah 14 it's the ingathering of the nations to worship Yahweh in the New Jerusalem, and it happens during the Feast of Sukkah. God is talking about the immigrant and the orphan and the widows who are in your town. He's basically saying everybody can come and be part of this. Everybody can become part of this. And isn't that interesting that this is so powerful? And here's Jonah saying, I don't want anybody else to be part of this. I'm just going to do this on my own. Thank you very much. And at the bottom of that Deuteronomy passage, this is a time when God's people are commanded to be joyful. And yet, here's Jonah, the only time he's joyful, but he's not joyful because strangers have come into God's kingdom and come into the temple and come to worship him. In fact, Jonah is mad about that. Jonah is joyful because he's got his own little shelter. God has provided him a plant to look after him from the heat of the sun, and Jonah, for the first time in this story anyway, is just really happy. There's such irony there, because as we know, what happens is that God then takes away both the plant and the shelter because he really wants to teach Jonah a lesson. The methods for God taking those things away, there are 3 ways that he does it, and they're all symbolic of God's judgment. And here's just a little bit more if you want to dig into this. So the worm first appears 2 other times in the Hebrew Bible, and each time it's about worms eating and causing ruin. So one of them is in Exodus 16, in the manna story in verse 17. It says do you remember that the Israelites were gathering much or little? They were supposed to gather enough manna for them for that day and not to leave any, not to hold any back till the next day. God was trying to teach them really clearly that they needed to trust him for manna each day and not try and sort of look after themselves. And it says that if they did hold on to it, the sons of Israel, here we go, Exodus 16:17, the sons of Israel gathered one very much, one very little, and Moses said to them, let no one leave any of it unto morning. But they didn't listen to Moses, and they left it to morning, and it was worm infested. So in other words, God sent the worm to make sure that they didn't try and look after themselves, that they trusted him. And again, there's another verse there you can look into for yourself about the curses that come on the land, inverted Eden curses, and the worm is responsible for that. It also says that God withered the plant, and there's just a lot of imagery about a withered vine or a withered plant in the Hebrew Bible. So the image of a healthy growing vine that quickly withers as a sign of God's judgment is a common motif in the prophets. That means the different books of the prophets for rulers in their kingdoms that grow and quickly pass away. And there's an example in Isaiah 40 there. All flesh is grass and all its covenant loyalty like the flower of the field. The grass withers and the flower fades, for the wind of Yahweh blows upon it. And then if you look down to Ezekiel, Israel's monarchy itself was likened to a flourishing vine blown by the east wind so that it withers. There you go, an east wind. That's coming up in a minute as well. Ezekiel 17, Son of man, propound a riddle and speak a parable to the house of Israel. An eagle took some of the land and blah, 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 placed it abundant waters, said in willow. It sprouted, became a low and spreading vine, with its branches turned towards him, but its roots remained under. So it became a vine, this is the house of Israel, and yielded shoots and sent out branches. Behold, though it is planted, will it thrive, or will it not completely wither as soon as the east wind reaches it? So this image of a withered vine, again, it occurs throughout the Old Testament, and it's suggesting that this is the result of people who don't follow through with God, kings and leaders who don't follow through, and where God's people sort of walk away from him or are judged because of some of the decisions that they make. And then I talked about the third one is the east wind, and the east wind has ominous associations of divine judgment. Here are some examples. In Genesis 41, the famine is caused by an east wind. The locusts are brought to Egypt by an east wind. In Exodus, God sends an east wind to part the waters, that's salvation, and destroy the Egyptians, that's judgment. That's Exodus 14. And then there's some other ones as well that you can look at. And then some other thoughts here about the an east hadashit wind, which occurs only here in the ancient Hebrew, this word hadashit. And its root could mean silent or plough. So again, Tim Mackey suggests it's likely that the word was chosen on the basis of a network of word plays and intertexts, meaning Elijah's experience of God's silence after the wind, or God's wind that appears in the beginning. So there is just this suggestion that God has sent this wind, partly in judgment and partly because he wants to meet with God. There's something going on here. It's hard to say exactly what. I just want you to look at this. At the end of this section, if you compare Jonah's scenario that he is in here with Psalm 121, it's rich with images. So Psalm 121 is fairly well known. It's the one that starts, I lift my eyes up to the mountains. But here's verse 5, Yahweh is your keeper. Well, unlike Cain, who said, who is your keeper? Yahweh is Yahweh is your shade on your right hand. Well, Jonahs didn't need Yahweh's shade because he got his self-made shelter. The sun will not strike you by day. Contrast Jonah, who is being beaten down by the sun now because God has taken away his shelter. Yahweh will keep you from all evil. Unlike Jonah's evil that he just can't escape. He will keep your soul. I think that's interesting. And here's that image that we used of Jonah sitting out on his rock, sulking and moaning, and then having a meaningful conversation with Jonah. And we talked about that whole bit at the end of the story where Yahweh, God sort of finally puts the question to Jonah and says, if you care so much about this one little plant, how about I could care about this massive city? I just want to say something about the city here. Yes, here it is. Just a little interesting point about Nineveh, the great city. This is a technique which this guy Jonathan Maganay discusses as, it's called a growing phrase through the book, and basically it's like a thematic repetition, adding words to the phrase each time they appear through the book. So if you think about this, the book of Jonah, you see this phrase 4 times. In chapter 1 it says, go to Nineveh, the great city. And then in chapter 3 it repeats that again, go to Nineveh, the great city. And later it says Nineveh was a great city, and it adds to God. A great city to God. And then right at the end in chapter 4, God is saying, almost in the last verse, shouldn't I have pity on Nineveh, the great city? And he adds here, which has in it more than 120,000 people. And this guy Maganay makes this point here. At first, we know only of Nineveh's size and its wickedness that has arisen to God. But when in chapter 3 Jonah comes to the city, it's then revealed as being a great city to God. This is a storytelling technique, because as yet we don't know whether this only concerns its great evil and therefore imminent punishment, which is what we think might be coming, or if the phrase implies some other relationship to God. And it's only right at the end of chapter 4, ending with God's question, where the fullness of the implications of the city's relationship to God and even its size are spelled out. So it's only right at the end we find out that God really cares about this city, that he cares about the myriads who don't know their left from their right and all their cattle. And it's just a really interesting dynamic going on here in storytelling about how we don't know much about this city, and only is its full extent of what God cares, what God thinks about it, revealed right at the end through the book. Here is a couple of quotes on the ending of Jonah that I think are really helpful. The narrative of Jonah's story lacks closure, a sense of completion, and a sense that nothing necessary has been omitted from the work. The book ends without a resolution to the major conflict of the narrative's plot. The reader experiences the greatest sense of closure at the end of the 3rd chapter, as Nineveh repents and God forgives. Even the 4th chapter begins by providing closure regarding Jonah's flight, but the book's final scene immediately reopens that closure just experienced by the reader. God's question concludes the book, leaving Jonah's response in the minds of the reader. This lack of closure at the end of the narrative is a literary device used to involve the reader in the ideological conflict that propels the real plot of the book, Jonah's sense of justice versus God's boundless mercy. The final scene blurs the narrative frame so that the world of the text reaches out and envelops the world of the reader, forcing us, those of us who are reading, to ask whose perspective we will adopt. I think that's really interesting. A guy called Walter Crouch wrote that. And then just one other quote here. The final scene is so skillfully designed that when Jonah insists on Yahweh's free pity, he cannot really avoid simultaneously conceding to his God the forgiving mercy he has extended to the pagans. But the narrator leaves the readers to draw this harmonising conclusion to themselves. Even the most morosely obstinate of them can hardly do other than, in Jonah's place, respond with gratitude to their God's final question. That's a guy called Hans Walter Wolff, and I think that's interesting, really challenging. I don't know how you guys have found this. I hope you enjoyed looking at the stories of the videos that Mal and Dave both said. There are extended versions of those videos kicking around as well on Facebook with just a little bit more. I just want to make 2 or 3 comments before we close this. I've put this slide up partly because it just makes me smile because the pictures are really fun, but also because it reminds me that some people have asked me the question, could this really happen? Could a man really survive inside a fish? Do you think this is a historically accurate story? Asking, I think what that means is, I think what we're asking there is, can God do miracles? Can God do supernaturally amazing things? And the answer to that for me is yes. I believe he can. I've seen it happen with my own eyes and I've read about it in the Bible. If you believe that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, which I do, then God can do anything. So it's well within God's power to use a fish to save a man for 3 days. For me, that's enough. I don't have more evidence than what I read in the Bible to say whether it is accurately true, but what I know is that the meaning of this story, the way that the author has written it, is really, really powerful and very important, and actually much more important than whether or not it's historically true. I'm not going to get hung up on the arguments about whether or not it did happen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the story and I'm going to understand its symbols and its motifs and its meaning. I'm going to look at the way that it connects right across the Hebrew Bible and describes the nature of God and challenges me to think about God's heart for people. For me, that's so much more important than trying to sort of get into an argument of whether or not it's historically true and how I can show that and how I can prove that. And it's a shame because some people have got sidetracked on that. You know, is it true? Is it accurate? How could that be possible? And even and lost sight of the real meaning of this story. And even kind of missed out on what they can learn from this story because they've judged people who don't hold the same view as them. I think it's possible to believe that this is totally historically true, and also possible to think, well, I'm not quite sure. And yet, for both for people who hold both of those views to get real, rich, deep understanding about the nature of God from this story. And that's the key thing for me here. I hope that makes sense. I'd be happy to chat with anybody further about that. I'm not an expert, but that's sort of where I've landed on it. Just a couple of other observations about the story. When you read this story, somebody I heard say it reminds me of the story of the prodigal son. There are three stories actually that Jesus tells in Luke 15: the lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son. And he talks about the nature of God and how he welcomes sinners back. And the thing is that when Jesus tells those stories, he tells them in response to questions from the Pharisees and teachers of the law. This is the start of Luke 15. The tax collectors, the sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. So all the sort of the people who perhaps wouldn't be welcome in church or in the synagogue were there. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." So they were judging Jesus, and then Jesus tells them the parables as if to say, God is judging you. And if you think about the parable of the prodigal son, you've got the older brother there at the end of the story, and very much sort of echoing the heart and the motivation of the religious leaders, basically saying, why would you let him back in? And yet Jesus is doing this because he's totally making the point about God's heart and God's love for people. That heart of God that we read in Jonah is very much expressed through Jesus' life. And in fact, in Matthew 12, something happens here where the Pharisees and the teachers of the law said to Jesus, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." And Jesus' response is to quote Jonah. Jesus answers, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but none will be given except the sign of the prophet Jonah." So Jesus knows his Bible. And he knows the story of Jonah. And he continues, "As Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the huge fish, so the Son of Man," that's him, "will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it." This generation meaning, I think he's meaning the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. "For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and now something greater than Jonah is here." So Jesus is alluding to Jonah and saying, look, the story of Jonah points to me and what I'm going to do. I'm going to be 3 days and nights in the heart of the earth. Okay? And obviously something happened in Nineveh. It suggests that was a historical event. Whatever else we do or don't believe about Jonah, something happened in Nineveh. And Jesus is alluding to the salvation that happened there and the salvation that's going to happen here, something even greater, which is beautiful, isn't it? And one other Bible passage, I just think that this, thinking about that last chapter of Jonah just reminds me of this Psalm 91. "Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. And I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust." It feels like a response to the story of Jonah, or part of a response is to say, God, I trust you. I trust you with everything. You are my refuge. I will rest in your shadow. Here's a poem. In fact, a poem from a book called You, Jonah. Apparently the book is quite old. Sorry, I'm just moving my slides around. This guy, Thomas John Carlyle, wrote some poems based on different parts of the story of Jonah. I just think they're really fun. So this is called You, Jonah. "You, Jonah, how low, how deep will you go to secure sleep? You, Jonah, how high will you fare, hoping I will ignore you there? You, Jonah, how far will you aim your mariner to protect your name from my claim?" And here's just 3 other poems. They're all quite short from the same book, which is apparently about 50 years old. I looked on Amazon, it cost 45 quid. This is called Reprimand to a Naive Deity. "I will not advertise this crazy scheme of yours. God, what a farce that men should sin and find escape. I mean, of course, not me, but all of our mutual antagonists. Dear God, King God, don't listen to their prayer." Here's another one. It's called Let's Play It Cool. "I know a better way to circumvent your silly streak of mixing love with righteous judgment. All I need to do is take the next flight west beyond your jurisdiction. This will give you time for sober second thoughts to swear off this kick of simple-minded kindness. I love the irony in these poems. And here's the last one, which is one I read on Sunday. And Jonah stalked to his shaded seat and waited for God to come around to his way of thinking. And God is still waiting for a host of Jonahs in their comfortable houses to come around to his way of loving. Lots to think about there. I really hope that you have enjoyed this series, and thank you those of you who've given me feedback on the different aspects of the book, and particularly on these bonus videos. I hope that they interest you. I hope they inspire you to dig into the Bible for yourself some more. I mentioned some tools back in the first one of these, study Bible and things. And I just wanted to very lastly flag up, I got a lot of this from a Bible Project class. The classroom is a part of the Bible Project's website, and it's growing and growing. The Jonah class has been there for about a year, and as I said, it was a beta. It's actually been taken down now, so you can't do Jonah, but there are some other classes there. There are 2 or 3. There's one on Ephesians, and there's this one, which is called the Introduction to the Hebrew Bible, and some of what we've been digging into here is brought out in this class, Hebrew Bible. These classes are around 20 hours. So they're quite an undertaking, but they're free, and you can do them at your own pace. Basically, you watch videos and then you respond to those videos with comments and bits of writing and reflection, and you just kind of work your way through. And there are other classes coming online as well. So if you want to, just go to the Bible Project website and find the classroom section, and all the details are there. And maybe this will inspire you to dig into the Bible for yourself. Do keep giving me feedback and let me know what you think. And I really hope you've enjoyed this. Have a great day.